She paid $8,000 for a strip of grass beside a Kansas highway. 23 years later, a $30 million project couldn't move an inch without her permission. This is the story of Ruth Calver, and it begins not with the land but with a library. If stories like this one help you sleep a little easier, subscribe before we go any further. New stories go up every week, and this one is just getting started. The atlas was Harold's idea, not the buying of it. You could find a Rand McNally Road Atlas at any gas station in the county for $3 and change, but the keeping of it. Harold Calver had a habit of folding back the corner of whatever page he was using, pressing the crease flat with his thumb, and then leaving the book open on the kitchen table like a conversation he hadn't finished yet. Kansas on one page, the county road grid on another, faint pencil marks tracking where he'd driven the fencing truck or where the creek had shifted after a wet spring. The atlas accumulated Harold the way old things accumulate the people who use them slowly without announcement, one small mark at a time. Ruth kept it after he died. She kept everything Harold left behind that was worth keeping, which was most of it. What she did not keep were his doubts, his detours, his occasional willingness to look the other way when something complicated crossed his path. Harold Calver had been a good man and a careful farmer and a genuinely kind husband for 27 years. And his one reliable flaw was that he believed the world ran on goodwill and handshakes and the basic decency of neighbors. Ruth believed in goodwill too. She also believed in reading the paperwork. This distinction, small as it sounds, is what this story's about. The Flint Hills of Kansas do not look like much to anyone passing through on the interstate. They look like nothing, frankly, rolling grassland in every direction, no trees to speak of, the sky enormous and indifferent, the wind a constant low conversation with itself. Travelers heading west tend to hold their speed and watch for the next exit. What those travelers do not see, because it takes time and patience and a particular kind of attention to see it, is that the Flint Hills are the largest remaining tract of tall grass prairie in North America. The rock beneath the grass defeated the plows. The grass defeated everything else. It has been here in essentially this form for 10,000 years. Ruth Calver had lived in the Flint Hills her entire life and understood this the way she understood most things, not as a fact to recite, but as a condition to work within. The land did not ask to be admired. It asked to be paid attention to. She had grown up the daughter of a county surveyor in the years when the county still did its own surveying before it hired contractors from Wichita and filed everything electronically, and let the institutional memory go wherever institutional memories go when the people who hold them retire. Her father, a quiet man named Delvey Pruitt, had taught her to read a plat map before she was 10 years old. He used to say that a plat map told you three things: what the land was, what it used to be, and what someone had forgotten to clean up. He said the third category was the most interesting. Ruth had never stopped believing him. She found parcel 14C on a Tuesday evening in October of 1998 in the Geary County Courthouse Annex, in a room that smelled like old paper and fluorescent light, in the particular institutional staleness of things nobody had touched in a very long time. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had been looking for the original right-of-way documentation on a fence dispute between two neighboring farms, a small and tedious matter that she had gotten involved in because one of the farms belonged to an elderly woman named Paulette Strang, who couldn't drive anymore and needed someone to go to the courthouse for her. Ruth had agreed because that was the kind of thing Ruth did, and because, if she was honest, she liked the courthouse annex. She liked the filing cabinets. She liked the dusty order of things arranged by date and parcel number, waiting in the dark for someone to come and ask about them. She found Paulette's fence documentation in 40 minutes. Then she kept reading. The folder that contained parcel 14C was labeled with a code she almost skipped, a survey reference number from 1952 cross-filed under a state highway expansion proposal that had been formally abandoned in 1959. She pulled it because her father had taught her to pull anything labeled abandoned, and read it before she put it back. Abandoned didn't always mean gone. Sometimes it just meant forgotten. She read the filing twice there at the metal table under the fluorescent light, with Paulette's papers already back in her bag and the room empty around her. In 1952, the state of Kansas had surveyed a narrow corridor along the western edge of K, 177 State Route K, 177, the two-lane highway that ran north-south through the Flint Hills as part of a proposed widening project for the route. The corridor was 18 feet wide. It ran for a half-mile along the eastern boundary of the land that would eventually become the Harwick agricultural parcel before the Harwick family sold off, and the land changed hands again and again until nobody quite remembered what it had originally been. The expansion project was canceled in 1959. Budget, that was the whole explanation. Project canceled. Budget reallocation, see Resolution 59-114. Ruth found Resolution 59-114. It canceled the project. It did not dissolve the corridor. Nobody had filed the paperwork to formally extinguish Parcel 14-C from the county land records. In 47 years, nobody had noticed. Or if they had, they hadn't thought it worth mentioning. Ruth sat with that for a moment. The corridor ran along the western edge of K177, which meant it ran between the highway and the land to the east. The land to the east was several hundred acres of flat open ground flint rock soil, at the surface decent tillable earth, underneath the kind of land that looked like nothing to a passerby, and looked like something else entirely to anyone who understood what flat and open and close to the highway meant in terms of development potential. The land had no road access from the south. There was a wetland designation in that direction that made it legally complicated. It had no practical access from the north private property, a family that had farmed it for 3 generations and showed no signs of moving. From the west, the only way in ran directly along K177. Directly through Parcel 14C, Ruth did not reach for her pencil yet. She read the filing a third time. She checked the tax records. She checked the dissolution records. She checked the resolution cross-references twice. Then she picked up the folder, walked to the window where the light was better, and read it one more time. Then she reached into her bag, took out the small spiral notebook she carried everywhere. Harold called it her thinking book and wrote down the parcel number, the survey date, the corridor dimensions, and 3 words not dissolved. Check taxes. She returned the folder to its place, said goodnight to the clerk who had forgotten she was there, drove home on K177 with the windows down and the October air cold and clean off the grassland. Harold was at the kitchen table with the atlas open to the county road grid when she walked in. He had been tracking a shortcut he thought he'd found to the feed supplier in Junction City. The atlas was marked up with small blue ballpoint lines, Harold's careful, considered shorthand. She sat down across from him. You find what Paulette needed, found that and something else. Harold looked up from the atlas. He knew that tone. It was the tone that meant Ruth had gone looking for one thing and come back with a different thing entirely, and the different thing was the one that mattered. What kind of something else? She told him about Parcel 14C, the corridor, the canceled expansion, the undissolved survey. Harold listened the way he always listened to Ruth, completely without interrupting, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. That land east of the highway. He meant the open ground. You think someone's going to want it? I think someone already does. I just don't know who yet. Harold looked at the atlas, then at his wife. You're going to find out. It wasn't a question. Ruth smiled. Harold smiled back. He pushed the atlas across the table toward her, the county grid page still open, and went to check on the calves. It took her 14 months. Not because the information was hidden, it wasn't, not exactly, but because it was distributed across enough separate filings and LLCs and deed transfer records that assembling it required patience and a particular tolerance for sitting in the courthouse annex on Tuesday afternoons, while the fluorescent light flickered and the clerk listened to a country station turned down low. Ruth developed this tolerance without effort. She had always found county records restful in a way she couldn't quite explain to anyone who hadn't grown up reading them. By the spring of 2000, she had a picture. 5 limited liability companies, all registered in Johnson County, Kansas, all with addresses that traced back to a single registered agent in Overland Park. Over the course of 18 months, these 5 entities had quietly purchased 412 acres of land east of K177 in Geary County in transactions small enough and spread out enough that no single purchase attracted attention. The sellers were retirement sales estate settlements, 1 foreclosure, 2 straightforward deals from farmers who decided the margins weren't worth it anymore. None of them had any reason to think twice about who was buying. None of them would have had reason to know about each other. Ruth pulled the registered agent records. The agent was a law firm. The law firm listed a single client for the relevant transactions. The client was a company called Pinnacle Land Partners, incorporated in Delaware, with a Kansas City mailing address and a website that described itself as a strategic land acquisition and development firm with a focus on undervalued rural assets adjacent to existing infrastructure corridors. Ruth read that sentence 4 times. She took out her thinking book and wrote Pinnacle Land Partners, 412 acres east of K177, No southern access wetlands. No northern access private. Western access only. She underlined western access only. Then below that, she wrote, the only legal path runs along the western edge of the eastern parcel line. Then she wrote parcel 14C. She closed the notebook, opened the atlas to the Geary County grid, found K177, traced the highway with her finger slowly from north to south until she reached the section where the corridor would have been. She picked up her pencil. She drew a single line, thin, straight, deliberate, along the western edge of the Pinnacle properties. 18 feet wide on paper was invisible. In the atlas, it was a mark thinner than the highway itself. But it was there. She studied it for a long moment. Then she wrote in small, careful letters alongside the line 14C, check auction schedule. The auction was scheduled for March. There are people who go to county tax auctions because they have to, and people who go because they want to, and people who go because something in them can't quite leave well enough alone. Ruth Calver belonged to all three categories simultaneously, which is not as comfortable a position as it sounds. She told Harold she was going to look at parcel 14C. Harold said, I know. She said, you're not going to ask what I think it's worth. Harold said, I think you already know what it's worth. I think you've known for a while. He paused. I think you're going to go find out if anyone else does. She drove to the Geary County Courthouse on a Tuesday in March. The auction was held in the commission meeting room, which had a drop ceiling and folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, and a table at the front with a microphone that amplified the auctioneer's voice slightly more than was necessary. There were perhaps 15 people in the room. Most of them were there for the farm equipment liens and the abandoned mineral rights parcels that made up most of the afternoon's listings. Ruth stood near the back wall. She had the atlas in her bag. She had her thinking book. She had a cashier's check made out for $10,000, her own savings money she had set aside over several years for a purpose she had not precisely defined until 3 weeks ago. The first hour was unremarkable. Equipment liens a small commercial parcel in town, a gravel easement dispute. Then the auctioneer read from his sheet parcel 14C Geary County, 18 feet wide, half-mile in length, western edge of K, 177 undissolved state survey corridor. Opening bid, $5,000. The room was quiet. Burl Whitson was standing near the window with a styrofoam cup of coffee and the particular ease of a man who has been attending these auctions for 20 years and knows exactly how they go. He was 62 years old and thick through the shoulders and had a way of occupying a room that suggested he expected to be noticed in it. He and Ruth had grown up in the same county and had known each other their entire lives in the specific way that people know each other in small counties, well enough to speak, not well enough to trust. He looked at the listing sheet. He looked at Ruth. He smiled not unkindly, but with the comfortable condescension of a man who has misjudged the same person more than once and not yet figured out why it keeps going wrong. $5,000 for a stripe of grass. His voice carried. A few people turned. Ruth, you planning to graze cattle on 18 feet? A couple of people laughed. Ruth did not look at him. She was looking at the auctioneer. $5,000, she said. Burl raised an eyebrow. He was not interested in the land. He had not done the research Ruth had done. He was interested in the comfortable and unconsidered way of people who have not lost it much in not being outbid by Ruth Calver for a piece of ground he'd just described as worthless. 7, the auctioneer said, looking for 8. Ruth's hand was already up. 8. Burl looked at her for a moment. Something stopped him, not calculation, not generosity, but a small, uncomfortable sense that he was missing something he couldn't name. He lifted his coffee cup instead, a gesture that meant nothing. The auctioneer brought the gavel down. Ruth walked to the front of the room, signed the paperwork, and took her copy of the deed. It was printed on standard county paper and described the parcel in legal language that made it sound exactly like what everyone in that room believed it was: 18 feet of undeveloped corridor with no practical use and no clear future. She folded it once and put it in her bag next to the atlas. Outside, the March wind was coming down off the Flint Hills with the particular persistence that March wind has in that part of Kansas, not fierce exactly, but present, insistent, unwilling to be ignored. Ruth walked to her truck, set her bag on the passenger seat, and drove home on K177 the same way she always went. She did not stop at the corridor. She had been to see it twice before in the months she'd been researching. She knew what it looked like: a narrow strip of fescue and bluestem running along the highway's edge, indistinguishable from any other unmanaged roadside strip, unless you were looking for the old survey markers, which Ruth had found and photographed in November. She didn't need to stop. She already knew what she had. Harold was at the kitchen table when she got home. The atlas was closed. He had made coffee. Well, we got it. He was quiet for a moment. Then what do we do now? Ruth poured herself a cup of coffee, set it down, opened the atlas to the Geary County grid, and looked at the pencil line she'd drawn 6 months ago. Now we take care of it, she said, and we wait. Harold nodded. He trusted her judgment in the way that long marriages sometimes produce, not blindly but completely, the trust of someone who has watched the same person be right more times than is easy to explain and has stopped trying to explain it. He reached across the table and tapped the atlas lightly once. How long? Ruth traced the pencil line with one finger. She thought about the 412 acres waiting on the other side of that line. She thought about Pinnacle Land Partners and their undervalued rural assets and their infrastructure corridors. She thought about the wetlands to the south and the family farm to the north and the highway running straight and useful right along the western edge of everything they needed. However long it takes, she said. Harold said nothing. He looked out the kitchen window at the Flint Hills, at the last light going gold on the grass, and he understood the way he understood most things. Ruth set her mind to that. She had already done the math. Harold Calver died on a Wednesday in September of 2003 during the sorghum harvest between the Southfield and the equipment barn. He was 61 years old. It was a heart attack, fast and complete, the kind that doesn't give a man much time to say goodbye. The paramedics told Ruth there was probably nothing she could have done differently, and she thanked them for saying so and did not believe them entirely, which is the burden of people who are used to thinking that paying close enough attention prevents most bad outcomes. She was 55 years old. She was a farmer and a widow, and the mother of a 22-year-old daughter named Dessa, who drove down from Wichita in 4 hours and arrived at the kitchen door red-eyed and quiet, which was how Dessa handled things she hadn't prepared for. The funeral was on Saturday. The neighbors came, and the county commissioners and the people from the Farm Bureau and Paulette Strang, who had someone drive her because she hadn't been able to drive in 2 years. Ruth stood through all of it with the specific composure of someone who had decided privately that there would be time for the other thing later. In the first week after Harold died, 3 different people suggested she sell the farm. 2 of them meant well. One of them was Burl Whitson, who called on Thursday with what he described as a sensible offer from a party that respects the property and whom Ruth thanked for calling and did not call back. Dessa stayed for 10 days. On the 9th day, she sat down across from her mother at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, what are you going to do?" Ruth was looking at the atlas. It was open to the Geary County grid the way Harold had left it the morning of the day he died. She had not closed it. "Keep farming," Ruth said. "The whole place by yourself, with help. The Danaker boys have offered to share equipment." The Pruitts. "Mom," Dessa's voice was careful. "You're 55. You can't." "I know what I can and can't do," Ruth said. "Not sharp, just certain." Dessa looked at the atlas. She had grown up with that book on the kitchen table and had long ago stopped seeing it as anything other than a fixture of the house, like the cast iron skillet and the barometer Harold kept by the back door. What about that strip of land, the one by the highway? She'd heard her parents mention parcel 14C once years ago in passing and retained it the way children retain things their parents seem to care about, without explaining why, lightly, without context. What about it? Is it worth anything? Ruth looked at the pencil line she'd drawn in 2000. 3 years old, now faded slightly, but still there. "Not yet," she said. Dessa looked at her mother for a moment with the particular expression of children who have learned that pressing further on certain questions produces only more questions. She let it go. She drove back to Wichita the next morning. Ruth stood at the kitchen window and watched the car disappear down the county road. And then she turned back to the atlas, and then she put on her coat, and then she drove to parcel 14C with the brush mower in the truck bed, because the grass along the corridor had gotten long over the summer, and it needed to be dealt with. She mowed it by herself in the September light. The wind off the hills, the highway traffic passing 20 yards to her left, none of it stopping, none of it even slowing down. Nobody in any of those cars knew what they were driving past. Nobody had any particular reason to. That was fine. Ruth had reason enough for all of them. The years after Harold passed had a particular texture to them that Ruth could not have described to anyone who hadn't lived something similar. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. More like the experience of moving through rooms that used to have a second person in them and learning slowly and without instruction how to fill the space differently. She didn't stop cooking for 2 right away. She didn't stop leaving Harold's side of the atlas page unwritten on. Some habits outlast the reason for them, and the question is not whether to keep them, but how long to let them teach you something before you let them go. She kept the farm. She kept Parcel 14C. She paid the annual tax assessment on it every November, $41, which was so small an amount that it sometimes felt almost embarrassing, the county's valuation of 18 feet of roadside corridor that nobody but Ruth Calver believed was worth a moment's thought. She kept the receipt in the atlas tucked into the Geary County grid page, folded once along the left edge where it didn't obscure the pencil line. By 2006, she had a small envelope of these receipts. By 2010, she had 2 envelopes. She kept them rubber banded together in the atlas, which she kept in the kitchen, which was the center of everything the farm had ever been and continued to be. The first offer came in the spring of 2008, which was not a good year for anyone holding real estate in rural Kansas or anywhere else, a fact the young man from Wichita seemed not to have fully absorbed. He arrived in a silver SUV on a Thursday afternoon in April, wearing a blazer that looked like it had been purchased specifically for rural appointments, and a smile that worked better in an office than it did standing in a muddy driveway. His name was Trent. He did not offer a last name. He had a folder of comparable sales and a printed summary of Parcel 14C's assessed value and a careful explanation of why $90,000 was in the current climate a generous offer for a strip of corridor land with no immediate development potential. Ruth listened to all of it. She had coffee ready because she had been raised to have coffee ready when someone made the drive out, regardless of whether she wanted them there. "That's a fair presentation," she said when he finished. Trent looked encouraged. He leaned forward slightly. "The party I'm representing is motivated. 90,000 is the opening position. There's flexibility. I'm sure there is. So you'll consider." "I've considered it," Ruth said. "Thank you for making the drive." Trent looked at the folder in his hands as though it had failed him personally. "Mrs. Calver, can I ask?" "You can ask whatever you'd like. I'm not going to sell." He left the folder on the porch steps, whether by accident or in some dim hope that she'd read it more carefully after he was gone. Ruth watched the silver SUV back down the county road and disappear. Then she picked up the folder, noticed it was from a real estate brokerage she recognized from Junction City, and noted the brokerage name in her thinking book alongside the date and the figure. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote Pinnacle, starting to feel the clock. Dessa called that Sunday, the way she called most Sundays since Harold died, 20 minutes reliable as a weather report, the two of them exchanging information about the week, with the practical affection of a mother and daughter who had long ago settled into a mode of communication that worked even if it wasn't always warm. "Anything new?" "Someone came about the 14C parcel." A pause, the strip by the highway. "That one. What did they offer?" "90,000. Dessa was quiet for a moment. $90,000 for a piece of roadside corridor was not by any obvious measure a number to decline without discussion. Ruth could hear her daughter doing the arithmetic, $41 a year in taxes, $8,000 paid, $90,000 offered. The math was not complicated. "Mom, I know. That's a lot of—" "I know what it is, Dessa." Another pause. "What did you say?" "I said no." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a daughter who has long suspected her mother of operating on a logic she hasn't been given full access to. Dessa had inherited Harold's patience, but not his confidence in Ruth's navigation. She had also, unlike Harold, grown up watching her mother be correct about things and still found it difficult to simply trust the direction without knowing the destination. "Can I ask why?" "You can," Ruth said. "It's not time yet." "Time for what?" Ruth looked at the atlas on the table. The pencil line. The envelope of tax receipts. The thinking book open to the entry she'd made 3 days ago. "I'll tell you when it is," she said. Dessa exhaled. It was not quite a sigh. It was the sound of someone filing information away under things I will need to revisit later and choosing for now to let it rest. They talked about the sorghum prices for another 10 minutes. Then they said goodbye. Ruth turned to the atlas. She thought about $90,000. She thought about what $90,000 had meant in 1998 when she'd first found the filing, and what it meant now and what it might mean in 5 years, and whether the difference between what something was worth and what someone was offering it would continue to grow or had already reached its peak. She thought about Pinnacle Land Partners and their 412 acres and their infrastructure corridors. She turned to a fresh page in her thinking book and drew a simple diagram. The K177 corridor, the Pinnacle parcels to the east, the wetlands, the private land to the north. She had drawn this diagram before. She drew it again because drawing it clarified things, because the act of putting known information onto paper was for Ruth the equivalent of thinking out loud. The picture hadn't changed. She underlined Western access only one more time. Then she closed the book. The county assessor's office sent the 2009 tax notice in November of the same year. $41 parcel 14C. Geary County landowner of record Ruth Calver. She wrote the check the same day it arrived as she always did. Filed the receipt in the atlas. Went back to the soybeans. This was for the next several years the essential rhythm of parcel 14C in Ruth Calver's life. It was a piece of land she owned and cared for, and kept records on and thought about regularly without discussing with anyone. It asked nothing of her except $41 a year and 2 hours in July with the brush mower, which she gave it without resentment, the same way she gave every acre of the farm what it needed without requiring it to explain its eventual purpose. The farm neighbors knew she owned something along the highway. You couldn't live in a county this size and mow a piece of ground twice a year for 7 years without someone noticing. But the land was so small and so characterless that it generated no particular curiosity. Burl Whitson, who still attended the same county meetings as Ruth and still carried himself with the ease of a man who had never quite stopped being surprised when things went against him, occasionally mentioned it with the mild amusement of someone who finds another person's eccentricity harmless. "Still keeping that ditch by the highway," he said once at a Farm Bureau meeting in 2010. "It's a legal parcel," Ruth said, "not a ditch." Burl smiled. "Sure it is." He moved on to the next agenda item. Ruth watched him go. She had a clear, untroubled view of exactly what Burl Whitson knew and didn't know, the same way she had a clear view of most things when she had enough information and enough time. He knew she owned the parcel. He did not know why. He had not done the research. He was not the kind of man who did the kind of research that required Tuesday afternoons in the courthouse annex with a fluorescent light and 30 years of county survey filings. That was fine. The second offer came in March of 2012. Not from a real estate broker, but from the county itself, a letter from the Geary County Road Department signed by the district engineer, proposing to acquire parcel 14C for the purpose of a minor highway shoulder improvement project. The offered price was $135,000. Ruth read the letter twice. It was politely written and contained several words like fair market value and public benefit and willing seller. She noted that the letter had been sent to her alone, which meant the county still thought of 14C as a routine acquisition, a loose end from the 1959 survey cancellation that had finally worked its way up someone's priority list. She called the district engineer's office the following morning. "I appreciate the county's interest," she said. "The answer is no." The engineer, a careful man who had clearly been briefed on the possibility of this response, said, "Mrs. Calver, I want to make sure you understand that the county's position is—" "I understand the county's position," Ruth said. "I've read your enabling statute and the relevant easement law. The county can pursue condemnation if they choose. I'd advise looking carefully at the tax record before you do." A pause. The tax record. Parcel 14C has been separately assessed and taxed by Geary County since 1961, 51 consecutive years. That's an unbroken chain of county recognition of its independent status as a legal parcel. If you file for condemnation, you'll be arguing in district court that you should be allowed to acquire land you've been taxing as separately valid for half a century. She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not a lawyer, but I'd look at that carefully." The phone was quiet long enough that she could hear papers moving on the other end. "We'll be in touch," the engineer said. They were not in touch. The letter was not followed by another. Ruth added the date and the figure to her thinking book. She wrote one word beneath it. "County knows. They'll wait." It was Dessa in the summer of 2013 who first understood something was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a crisis, nothing so clean as that. Wrong in the quieter sense of a daughter who has been given pieces of a picture over 15 years and has finally put enough of them together to see the outline of the shape, even if she can't yet see the whole thing. She had come down for a long weekend in June the way she did twice a year, bringing her laptop and her practical nature and the particular tension of someone who manages other people's finances for a living and finds the farm's record-keeping simultaneously admirable and maddening. She was helping Ruth reconcile the equipment maintenance records when she opened the wrong drawer looking for a pen and found under the atlas in the thinking book and 2 rubber-banded envelopes of tax receipts, a manila folder labeled 14C Research. Ruth was at the stove. Dessa opened the folder. Inside, the 1952 survey filing photocopied. The 1959 cancellation resolution photocopied. The registered agent records for 5 LLCs in Johnson County, a hand-drawn diagram Ruth's drafting careful and precise, showing the K177 corridor, the Pinnacle parcels, the wetlands, the private land to the north. An annotated list of all land transactions in the eastern portion of the county between 1998 and 2002, with the Pinnacle acquisitions marked in pencil. Dessa stood at the kitchen counter and read through the folder slowly. Then she read it again. Then she sat down. Ruth had not turned around. She had heard the drawer open. She had heard the silence that followed, which had a different quality than ordinary silence. "Mom, I know. This is—" Dessa stopped. Started again. "You've been tracking Pinnacle Land Partners since 1998. Since October 1998, yes. You bought that parcel knowing they'd need it. I bought it because it was available and because the research suggested someone would need it eventually. I didn't know it would be Pinnacle specifically. I knew it would be someone." Dessa looked at the diagram. At the wetlands marked in blue pencil, the private land marked in red. At the phrase Western Access only underlined twice in her mother's handwriting. "The 90,000, she said slowly. "The county offer." Both of them understood what they needed. Neither of them offered what it was worth. Ruth turned from the stove. "There's a difference between price and value, Dessa. People confuse them because price is the number they can see." Dessa looked at her mother for a long moment, at the woman who had been driving to the courthouse annex on Tuesday afternoons for 15 years, mowing a strip of roadside grass twice a summer, paying $41 a year on a parcel nobody else believed was worth the paperwork, all without saying a word to the one person in her life she spoke to every Sunday. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Because you would have worried," she said, "and there was nothing to worry about yet. And now you know." Ruth set 2 plates on the table. "Now you can stop worrying about the thing you didn't know about and start paying attention to the thing you do." Dessa looked at the diagram again. At the pencil line marking Parcel 14C, thin and straight and exactly where her mother had put it in 1998. "You're sure?" "I'm patient," Ruth said. "That's not the same thing, but it's close enough." Burl Whitson arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2016, which was not a coincidence Ruth failed to notice. He came in a different truck than he used to drive, newer, quieter, and he wore a sport coat instead of the Farm Bureau vest, and he carried himself with the careful neutrality of a man who has been briefed on a situation and told to approach it without his usual assumptions. Ruth had seen him coming down the county road from the kitchen window. She had put the kettle on. He knocked. She opened the door. "Ruth." "Burl." She stepped back. "Come in." He sat at the kitchen table where Harold used to sit, which Ruth noticed, and Burl did not. He set a folder on the table which she did not look at. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. "I'm representing Pinnacle Land Partners," he said. She had not known this specifically, but she was not surprised. Burl had moved from farming into land consulting. Sometime in the early 2000s, a transition she had noted in her thinking book as "Whitson now works for buyers." He had local knowledge and county relationships, and the easy manner of a man who had grown up here and never left, which made him useful to outside developers in exactly the way that Ruth had always considered him underestimated. "They want 14C, she said. 280,000. He said it without preamble, the way he would have said it to anyone else, a number large enough to signal seriousness, respectful, without being extravagant. "Cash. Quick close." Ruth wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She looked at Burl Whitson across the table, at a man she had known for 50 years, who had laughed at her in a county auction room in 2001, who had called her parcel a ditch at a Farm Bureau meeting in 2010, who was now sitting in her kitchen with someone else's money and someone else's urgency. He had known Ruth Calver for 50 years, long enough that he thought he knew how she made decisions, what she valued, where her limits were. He had been wrong before in small ways. He was not yet certain he was wrong now. He could not in this moment quite read her face. "Burl," she said, "do you know why Pinnacle needs that parcel?" He paused. "They have a development project. 412 acres east of K. 177, Ruth said. Assembled between 1999 and 2002 through 5 LLCs, all registered to the same agent in Overland Park. No southern access because of the wetland designation. No northern access because the Gruder family hasn't sold in 3 generations and isn't going to. The only practical road access runs west along the K177 corridor." She set down her cup. "Through my land." Burl looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise because Burl Whitson was experienced enough to not show surprise easily, but a recalibration, a quiet reassessment of the room he thought he'd walked into. "You've done your homework." "I've been doing my homework since 1998. She said it without heat. It was simply the fact of the matter. Tell your client I appreciate the offer. Tell them the parcel isn't for sale. And tell them she picked up her cup again, that when they're ready to discuss terms instead of price, they know where I live. Burl picked up his folder. He stood. He looked at Ruth for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not admiration exactly, and not quite respect, but something adjacent to both that sat uncomfortably on a man who had spent 40 years being certain he knew the county better than anyone else. What kind of terms, he said. The kind that are worth waiting for, Ruth said. He left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched his truck go. Then she took out the thinking book, opened it to the current page, and wrote, Whitson now working for Pinnacle. They sent their local man. They're serious. She paused, but not serious enough yet. She wrote the date, she wrote the figure. She wrote below it, not yet. The phone call came on a Thursday morning in April of 2024, and Ruth was ready for it, the way she was ready for most things she had seen coming for a long time. Not with excitement, not with anxiety, but with the particular still attention of someone who has been waiting at a particular place on the road and has finally heard the sound of tires on gravel. She had been at the county planning office 3 weeks earlier, having driven in on a Tuesday out of a habit that had never entirely left her, and she had asked the clerk for the current permit applications under review for the Eastern K177 corridor. The clerk, a young woman who had not been there in the years when Ruth was a regular, had handed over the file without particular ceremony. Ruth had taken it to the table by the window. She had read 30 pages before she found what she was looking for. Page 31, Site Access Plan, Road Width Requirements, Proposed Entrance Configuration. And there it was in the architectural shorthand of a document that assumed everyone reading it already knew the relevant geography. Primary Access Road Western Corridor K, 177 alignment across Parcel 14C per proposed easement agreement. Per proposed easement agreement. There was no easement agreement. There had never been an easement agreement. Whoever had drafted this document had assumed one existed or had assumed one could be obtained without difficulty, or, and this was the possibility Ruth found most interesting, had not yet verified that the parcel in question was owned by a woman who had been paying $41 a year to keep it exactly this unavailable for exactly this long. She had photocopied page 31. She had driven home. She had called Dessa. I need you to help me find a property lawyer. Dessa had been quiet for exactly 3 seconds. The parcel. The time is right. Another pause shorter. How sure are you? Ruth looked at the atlas on the kitchen table. The pencil line she'd drawn in 2000. 24 years old, now faded to the point where you had to know it was there to see it. Certain enough, she said. Dessa had found Verna Okafor in Topeka within a week. A property and land use attorney with a reputation for reading documents carefully in a manner that suggested she had never once been intimidated by anyone with a larger retainer. She had driven to the farm on a Saturday, sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder and the atlas and the 2 rubber-banded envelopes and the thinking book open to the beginning, and she had read for 45 minutes without speaking. Then she had looked up. You kept the research current, she said. Every year. The tax receipts go back to 2001. Every year without exception. Verna turned to the page with the diagram. She looked at it for a moment. You drew this in. 2000, Ruth said, before the auction. Verna was quiet for a moment. She had the look of a lawyer who has spent enough time in courtrooms to know that most cases turn on the quality of the record and who had just been handed 23 years of immaculate, unprompted documentation by a 70-year-old farmer who had never been to law school. They're going to push back, Verna said. They always push back. I know. They'll claim abandonment if they can find anything to support it. The corridor's status is unusual enough that they'll have room to argue. They taxed it, Ruth said. The county taxed it every year. I have every receipt. She pushed the envelopes across the table. You can't abandon something the county has been recognizing as a separate legal parcel for 63 years. Verna looked at the envelopes, then at Ruth. When Pinnacle calls, she said, don't discuss figures. Tell them your attorney will be in touch. I know, Ruth said. Verna picked up her coffee. How did you know they'd call before you called them? Ruth turned to the atlas to page 31 of the permit application she'd copied and tucked into the Geary County grid page. They filed for approval, she said, before they had the easement secured. She looked at Verna. They were confident. People who are that confident don't check the things they're certain about. That was a Thursday. Pinnacle's lawyer called on a Thursday 3 weeks later. The voice was pleasant and professional and clearly accustomed to transactions of this size going smoothly. He said $450,000 cash 30-day close. He said Pinnacle was a motivated buyer. He said this was a fair reflection of the parcel's value. Ruth said, "I'll have my attorney return your call." She called Verna before she put the coffee back on. Verna called Pinnacle's lawyer the following morning. She said, "My client is not interested in a sale." She said, "Parcel 14C controls access to your client's entire Eastern K177 holdings." She said, "My client's position is a permanent easement, $3,800 per month, inflation-adjusted, transferable to her heirs." Pinnacle went quiet for 11 days. On the 12th day, they filed a legal challenge in Geary County District Court, claiming adverse possession that Parcel 14C had been effectively abandoned since the 1959 cancellation, and that Pinnacle, through its predecessor land interests, had the stronger claim to the quarter. Ruth was sitting at the kitchen table when Verna called to tell her. She picked up the atlas, opened it to the Geary County grid, looked at the pencil line, the tax receipt envelopes, the 43 years of county assessments she had documented and organized, and kept in a kitchen drawer without ever being entirely certain this moment would come. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Everything you have," Verna said. "Every receipt, every survey reference, every record." "I have it," Ruth said. "All of it. I've had it since 1998. On the other end of the line, Verna was quiet for a moment. "Ruth," she said, "how long ago did you pull the original 1959 county resolution?" Ruth looked at the atlas, at the folded document tucked behind the Geary County grid page, older than the tax receipts, older than the thinking book placed there in October of 1998, and not moved since. 26 years ago, she said. "I've been carrying it the whole time." The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in June, which gave Verna 3 weeks to build the record, and Ruth 3 weeks to do what she had always done when something important was coming. Pay attention, prepare quietly, and resist the urge to speak before there was something worth saying. She spent the first week going through the manila folder and the atlas, in the 2 envelopes of tax receipts, with the methodical care of someone who has kept good records and wants to make sure they are as good as she believes them to be. She found no gaps. Every year from 2001 to 2024 was documented. Every tax payment, every receipt, every annual mowing. She had, without ever quite deciding, to maintain the kind of paper trail that lawyers spend careers trying to reconstruct after the fact. She sent everything to Verna in a flat-rate box on a Friday. Inside, she included a handwritten index she'd made on 2 pages of her thinking book, listing each document by year and category, because she had been her father's daughter long enough to know that a record is only as useful as your ability to find what you need in it quickly. Verna called when this box arrived. "This is complete." "Yes, Ruth, most landowners in a dispute like this would have half of what you've sent me." A third. A pause. "You kept receipts for the brush mowing." "It's maintenance of a legal parcel," Ruth said. "Of course I kept receipts." Verna was quiet for a moment. "Pinnacle's lawyers are good. They're going to argue that the 1959 cancellation created an ambiguous status that constitutes constructive abandonment under Kansas property law. It's not a strong argument, but it's a real one." "The county taxed it," Ruth said, "every year." "I know. If the county believed it was abandoned, they had 63 years to stop sending the tax notice. They didn't stop. They kept sending it. I kept paying it." She looked at the atlas on the table. "You cannot maintain a legal theory of abandonment against a parcel you've been taxing as valid since 1961. That's not an argument. That's a contradiction." "That," Verna said, "is exactly what I'm going to say." The Geary County District Courthouse had been built in 1937 and renovated in 1981 and smelled on warm mornings like old wood and the particular institutional cleanliness of places that are cleaned regularly but never quite shed their history. Ruth had been in this building many times over the course of her life, for the estate settlement after Harold, for various county board hearings, for the quiet bureaucratic occasions that accumulate across a life lived in one place for 67 years. She knew where the water fountain was. She knew which of the courtroom doors stuck. She arrived with Dessa on her left and Verna on her right, which was not a position she had planned, but which felt, walking up the front steps in the June morning light, exactly correct. Dessa had driven down from Wichita the night before. She had sat at the kitchen table after dinner with the thinking book open in front of her, reading backward through the entries, 23 years of dates and figures and names and small observations, her mother's handwriting consistent and unhurried from the first page to the last. She had not said much. Ruth had not required her to. At some point, Dessa had looked up and said, "Did you ever doubt it?" Ruth had thought about that honestly. "I doubted the timing," she said. "I never doubted the land." Pinnacle's legal team was 3 people. 2 associates and a senior partner named Greer, who had the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being the most prepared person in rooms like this one. He had a presentation, he had case citations, he had a theory of constructive abandonment that referenced 4 Kansas precedents and 1 federal case from 1987. He made his argument clearly and without unnecessary elaboration, which Ruth respected even as she recognized it as wrong. Verna let him finish, then she stood up. She put 3 documents on the table in front of the judge. She did not theatricalize it. She simply placed them there. The 1956 survey, filing the 1959 county resolution, and a summary table she had prepared showing the Geary County tax assessment for Parcel 14C in every year from 1961 to 2024-63, consecutive entries, each one treating the parcel as a separately valid piece of land. Your Honor, Verna said, Pinnacle's argument requires the court to find that Parcel 14C was effectively abandoned. But the County of Geary has assessed and taxed this parcel as independently valid land every single year since 1961. She paused. 63 years. Not most years. Every year, including this one. Another pause. The county cannot maintain a theory of abandonment against a parcel it has recognized and taxed without interruption for 63 consecutive years. And a subsequent purchaser cannot claim adverse possession against a parcel that has been continuously recognized in county records throughout that entire period and maintained by its legal owner, my client Ruth Calver, for the past 23 years. She set down the summary table. You cannot abandon something the county never stopped taxing. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Harlan, who had the measured attention of someone who reads documents before she reads, people looked at the summary table. She turned to the 1959 resolution. She turned to the survey filing. She looked at Greer. Counsel, do you dispute the accuracy of these tax assessments? Greer looked at the table. Ruth watched him look at it, watched the moment when a prepared man encounters the one document he didn't anticipate and has to decide in real time how to respond. He was good enough to respond honestly. No, Your Honor. Then the county's own record establishes continuous recognition of this parcel's validity. Judge Harlan set down the table. The constructive abandonment claim fails on its own terms. Parcel 14C remains a valid legal parcel. The challenge is denied. She brought the gavel down once lightly the way judges do when the answer was always going to be this one, and everyone in the room probably knew it. Dessa reached over and took Ruth's hand. Ruth did not cry. She was not in this moment surprised she had known the record. She had known the law. She had known in the quiet and certain way she knew most things. She had had 23 years to think about that. This was how it would go. But knowing a thing and being present for the moment it becomes true are different experiences. And she sat with both of them for a moment without trying to resolve the difference. She squeezed Dessa's hand once. Then she let go and picked up her bag. Pinnacle's senior partner called Verna before they had reached the parking lot. Verna listened for 30 seconds. Then she said, my client's terms haven't changed. Permanent easement. $3,800 a month, inflation-adjusted, transferable to her heirs. A pause. I'll wait. She held the phone away from her ear and looked at Ruth with the expression of a lawyer who has heard the sound of a negotiation collapsing in real time and finds it professionally satisfying. They want a counteroffer. Tell them that is my counteroffer, Ruth said. Verna relayed this, listened, covered the phone. They'll do $3,200. Number. Verna uncovered the phone. No, she listened again. She says no. Another pause. She says she's been patient for 23 years. She can be patient for another week. Ruth walked to the car. The call Verna was waiting for came 4 days later on a Sunday morning, which Ruth noted was an unusual day for legal negotiations and suggested that someone at Pinnacle had been having a difficult weekend. She was in the garden when her phone rang. The small kitchen garden Harold had built from salvaged railroad ties in 1991, which Ruth had maintained every season since. In the straightforward way she maintained everything, not because it was easy, but because it was hers, and it needed tending. She had tomatoes in. Basil. One row of pole beans that was always more trouble than it was worth, and that she planted anyway every year because Harold had liked pole beans. She wiped her hands on her work pants and answered. It was Verna. They've accepted. Ruth stood in the garden with the Sunday morning quiet around her. The birds working the field edge, the wind moving through the sorghum to the south, the particular Sunday stillness of the Flint Hills, which was not the absence of sound but a different arrangement of it. Every term. 3,800 a month, permanent inflation adjusted at 3% annually transferable, without restriction to Dessa and her heirs. Ruth was quiet for a moment. And the library. This was the term Greer had found most unexpected, the one Verna had introduced last after the monthly figure, and the inflation adjustment and the transferability clause had already been agreed in principle. $40,000 paid directly to the Geary County Public Library System, designated for the preservation and digitization of historical county records. They agreed, Verna said. They weren't happy about it, but they agreed. Ruth looked at the pole beans, at the tomato cages Harold had built from wire, and salvaged rebar still standing after 30 years because Harold had built things to last. Good, she said. She told Dessa that evening standing at the kitchen counter while the light went long and gold through the west window the way it did in June, the way it had done every June of Ruth's life in this house. Dessa had stayed for the weekend. She was at the table with her laptop doing the things she did when she was processing information she hadn't finished with yet, working on something unrelated with one part of her mind while the larger part ran quietly in the background. Ruth recognized this because Dessa had done it since she was 12 years old, and because Ruth did the same thing herself, though she did it with her hands in soil rather than with a keyboard. They accepted, Ruth said. Dessa looked up. Everything. Dessa was quiet for a moment. Ruth could see her doing the arithmetic, not the property arithmetic, which Dessa had understood for years now, but the other kind. The arithmetic of what her mother had carried alone for a long time, and what it meant that it was now finally resolved. The library, Dessa said. Why the library? Ruth poured 2 glasses of iced tea and set one in front of her daughter. She sat down at the table, Harold's chair, which she still thought of as Harold's chair, and sat in anyway because it was the chair that faced the window, and the window faced the Flint Hills, and the Flint Hills were worth facing. Because I found the filing in the library, she said. Dessa looked at her. In the courthouse annex, Ruth said. Tuesday evening, October 1998. I went in for Paulette Strang's fence dispute, and I found parcel 14C in a folder nobody had opened in 40 years. She picked up her tea. That folder existed because someone in 1952 wrote down what they'd measured, and someone else in 1959 filed the cancellation without destroying the original, and someone else maintained the filing system well enough that it was still there 39 years later when I needed it. She looked at Dessa. The library made the whole thing possible. It seemed right to give something back. Dessa was quiet for a long moment. You've been planning that part too. I've been thinking about it, Ruth said. There's a difference. Dessa looked at the atlas on the table. She had been looking at it differently since she'd read the thinking book, not as a fixture of the house anymore, but as what it actually was, a 26-year record of a decision made and maintained and carried through without fanfare or complaint or anyone else's permission. Mom, she said, can I ask you something? You can ask me anything, Dessa. You always could. Were you lonely? Carrying all of this alone? Ruth thought about that. She thought about the Tuesday afternoons in the courthouse annex, and the November mornings writing the $41 check, and the July afternoons on the brush mower with nobody watching, and the Sunday phone calls where she'd said, I know to Dessa's questions without saying what she knew. She thought about Harold at the kitchen table with the atlas open, and the way he'd pushed it across to her without asking for an explanation. I had Harold for the first part, she said, and I had the land, and I had the work. She looked at her daughter. Lonely isn't quite the right word. I was alone with something I understood. That's different. Dessa nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone receiving an answer that will take time to fully understand, but that is clearly completely honest. They signed the easement agreement on a Tuesday morning at the end of June at the county recorder's office in the same building where Ruth had filed the original deed in 2001. The recorder's office had the same fluorescent lights and the same institutional quiet, and Ruth noted a different clerk than the one who'd been there when she started, a young man, this time efficient and impersonal, who processed the paperwork without any awareness that the document he was stamping represented the resolution of something that had begun in this same building 23 years earlier. Ruth did not explain this to him. It was not strictly speaking his business. She signed where Verna indicated. Dessa witnessed. The clerk stamped the agreement, logged it into the county record, and handed Ruth her copy. Ruth folded it once lengthwise and put it in her bag. Outside, the June morning was bright and still the way Flint Hills mornings are when the wind takes a breath between efforts. The courthouse lawn was dry from 2 weeks without rain. A meadowlark was making its argument from the top of a parking sign at the far end of the lot The same song meadowlarks have been making in this part of Kansas since before there were parking signs to sing from, reliable and unhurried and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. Dessa stood beside her. What now? Ruth considered the question. She thought about the farm, which still needed the July mowing, and the sorghum pre-treatment, and the equipment maintenance that couldn't be put off past August. She thought about the thinking book, which had a final entry to make. She thought about the atlas which she had carried to the signing in her bag out of habit, or out of something less nameable than habit, the sense that it belonged at the completion of the thing it had been part of from the beginning. Now I go home, she said. She drove back on K177 the way she always went, the way she had gone 10,000 times over the course of her life, and several thousand times specifically since October of 1998, when the highway had begun to mean something different than it meant to anyone else who drove it. She slowed when she reached the corridor. She did not stop. She never stopped. That had always seemed like the wrong kind of attention, to give it the showy kind, the kind that required an audience. But she slowed enough to see it clearly as she passed 18 feet of bluestem and fescue running along the highway's edge, the old survey markers still at each end. If you knew to look for them, the grass cut back 2 weeks ago because July was coming, and the mowing was always done in July. It looked like nothing. It looked like a strip of grass beside a road, which is exactly what it was and exactly what it had been for 63 years and exactly what it would continue to be, except that now there was a signed agreement in Ruth Calver's bag confirming that every vehicle that would ever enter the Pinnacle Land Partners development on the eastern side of K177 would do so across this particular nothing on terms Ruth had set for as long as the land stood. She drove on. The kitchen was the same temperature it always was on a June afternoon, warm from the morning. Cooling slowly, the cross ventilation from the south window, moving the air just enough to make it bearable. The atlas was on the table where she'd left it. The thinking book was beside it, open to the last written page. Ruth set her bag on the counter. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink. She looked out the window at the Flint Hills, at the grass moving in the returning wind, gold green in the afternoon light, the same landscape that had been here before her, and would be here after her, patient and enormous and entirely unbothered by the transactions of human beings. She dried her hands. She sat down at the table. She opened the thinking book to the last entry and read it, the note she'd made 4 days ago when Verna had called with the news of Pinnacle's acceptance. 2 lines, the date, every term. Then below that, the figure she'd written and then crossed out because it wasn't the figure that mattered, $3,800 per month. Library, $40,000. Below the crossed-out figure, she had written one question to herself, and she picked up her pen now. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, done. She closed the thinking book. She picked up the atlas, Harold's atlas, marked and folded and worn at the spine from 26 years of being open to the same page, and she turned to the Geary County grid. The pencil line was there, thin, faded, exact. 18 feet wide, in reality invisible on the page, unless you knew precisely where to look. She looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something you have carried for a long time and are finally setting down. Not releasing it, it would always be part of what she knew, what she'd done, what she'd been patient enough to see through. But setting it down. She closed the atlas. She set it on the table where Harold had always left it open before. Closed now, and she went to start dinner. Through the kitchen window, the Flint Hills held the late afternoon light, the way they always held it, evenly and without preference, the grass going amber at the tips as the sun moved west. The meadowlarks were at it again, somewhere out past the equipment barn. The wind had settled into its evening rhythm, lower, slower, the long exhale of a Kansas day finding its end. The atlas sat on the table, closed, worn at the spine. Harold's handwriting on the inside cover, his name, and the year he'd bought it, 1987, in the careful ballpoint print of a man who labeled things because he believed the things he owned deserved to be claimed. Below his name in different handwriting, Ruth's,